Hello. This discussion is of my senior honors thesis, The Politics and Ontology of Freedom. First, let's get a look at the cast of characters. First, we have German-American philosopher Hannah Arendt, born in what was Prussia in 1906 and educated in the Weimar Republic. Next, we have the French philosopher Simone de Beauvoir, born just 2 years later. And finally, we have Simone de Beauvoir's classmate, Simone Weil, born in 1909. Now that we've met the cast of characters, two Simones and a Hannah, as I like to say, we shall address what might be an elephant in the room. What is ontology? It's a fair question, to be sure. Ontology is a subset of metaphysics, which is itself a branch of philosophy concerned with asking so-called first principles. These are questions we generally avoid in day-to-day life, like, do things even exist? Or, to the extent that things exist, what is their true nature? Ontology deals specifically with questions about being and human being. So this raises the question of how a first principle could be political. Well, the simple answer is that anything being debated can become political. And anything political can be traced back to so-called first principles. You might be surprised at just how many things you assume before you make an argument. The more specific answer will hopefully become clearer as we look at the philosophy of Hannah Arendt, Simone de Beauvoir, and Simone Weil. Oh, and one last definition before we get into the heart of the issue. Existentialism is a difficult to define philosophical grouping. For the sake of argument here, let's think of it as a mid-20th century European or continental philosophy, which is founded in the assertion that existence precedes essence. Among other things, this means that your life and its meaning are not predetermined by God or an ethical code that exists prior to human interpretation. That is to say, this life of yours, you're creating it. After reading the philosophy of Arendt, Beauvoir, and Weil, as well as reading up on existentialism, I encountered my first set of philosophical problems that would eventually comprise my thesis. Existentialism is often incorrectly classified as a Marxist philosophy. So my questions were, why? And is it actually Marxist? It soon began to appear that, as might be expected, discussions of the politics of existentialism become less frequent after 1991 with the fall of the Soviet Union. One potential explanation is that with the supposed triumph of capitalism over socialism, such conversations were rendered irrelevant. At the same time that discussions of the politics of existentialism become less relevant, these three philosophers, Hannah Arendt, Simone de Beauvoir, and Simone Weil, only rise in popularity. So we have two trends, one going down and the other going up, but they don't meet nicely in the middle. With my second observation, we will set off to answer the major questions of this thesis. My observation was that Arendt, Beauvoir, and Weil, of course, are excluded from early accounts of mid-century philosophy, and unfortunately, to this day, they remain excluded from discussions of existentialism. So what gets left out because of these omissions? Focusing only on the political consequences, I noticed that all three share an ontology that places human freedom at the center of being. That alone is an existentialist trait. Remember, this is your life you're defining. You would be free to do it. Furthermore, with time, I noticed that they each applied their ontology of freedom to a philosophy of Karl Marx. While some critics and commentators pointed out that they all discussed Marx individually, as far as I can tell, no one has looked at them comparatively for their critiques of Marx. Or, for that matter, no one has done a comparative study of these three philosophers together at all. So, very briefly, let's engage in one right now. Firstly, Hannah Arendt, in a passage from her book, The Human Condition, said, and I quote, "A fundamental contradiction runs like a red thread through the whole of Marx's thought," end quote. On the one hand, Arendt points out that Karl Marx argues communism will liberate the oppressed masses from their laboring condition. On the other, she notes, Marx states that labor is a fundamental reality of human life. In her eyes, these two statements taken together would mean that the Marxist revolution would have to lead to a fundamental change in man's very nature, that is to say, in human ontology. And she doesn't see that as possible. Moving on, we get to Simone de Beauvoir. In the middle of her critique on Marx, found in The Ethics of Ambiguity, Simone de Beauvoir says that, and I quote, "Freedom is the source from which all significations and values spring," close quote. On the other hand, she notes that, and here we are again with the quote, "In Marxism, if it is true that the goal and meaning of action are defined by human wills, these wills do not appear as free," close quote. She notes that revolution itself, not freedom, or even so much the outcome of that same revolution, appear to be the central goal of the Marxist revolutionary. But in Marxism, Beauvoir says that determinism propels the revolution, not the will of the revolutionaries propelling the revolution. Determinism, by the way, is the idea that events are defined by some greater force than man, whether it's God, the blind principles of cause and effect, or even the force of history itself. So, moving on, finally, we get to Simone Weil. In Oppression and Liberty, Simone Weil argues that the main goal of current manifestations of Marxism is simply the growth of Marxism. As with so many grand belief systems or political parties, she notices a corrupting and blinding quest for power and a submission of human will and freedom to this quest. Weil traces the belief of endless growth of power back to the philosophy of Karl Marx. And just as a side note, Hannah Arendt, who also noticed this belief in the endless growth of power and just in endless growth in general, traced the belief back to Adam Smith, the rise of modernism, and the rise of capitalism. And here we run into a particularly interesting observation. Each of the three ultimately cautions us in a roundabout way about the need to think critically about our belief systems for precisely this kind of reason. Sometimes we think we believe one thing, and we think we're diametrically opposed to some other party, only to later realize that the fundamental assumptions about our belief system are the same fundamental beliefs in theirs. And so when we realize we share something fundamental with this group against whom we define ourselves, sometimes we realize that we've got a ridiculous or harmful belief assimilated into our own. So what? Well, in terms of conclusions, part of me would love to say that the three of these women were all close friends, and together they came up with some good alternative to the capitalism-Marxism dialectic we love so much. But that didn't happen. And in a way, it's much better that it didn't. Unfortunately, even the political groupings I just mentioned are nearly impossible to define, and they're steeped in more history than I could possibly go into here. An alternative is not what these women were getting at. What they do offer is an indispensable bit of caution against ceding your own will and freedom to some force that you yourself cannot define. And we get that with their critique of Marxism. Be careful with any party identification or political identification, they seem to say. Focus most on deep thought and justification for each of your actions and beliefs within the context of the situation and within your own value system. And always respect the freedom of others. And in terms of the political consequences, well, when we exclude them from discussions of the politics of existentialism and focus mostly on male thinkers like Jean-Paul Sartre or Maurice Merleau-Ponty, which is what most scholars did at first, then existentialism looks Marxist. But can we really say that when we consider these three female thinkers? Secondly, It must be said that these women have not historically appeared in discussions in the same amount as their male counterparts. Consequently, philosopher, in fact, might be the last title we give to each of these thinkers. Some would like to call Arendt first a political theorist, and Beauvoir a gender theorist, and Weil a religious mystic. But these women are all philosophers. And when we look at exclusions like this, we realize that it's much worse to have simply been ignored than if they'd just been challenged properly in debates while they were still alive. So ultimately, these women were onto something. They were acutely aware of the problems of capitalism, but clearly they weren't Marxist either. So not only are we misremembering history when we exclude them and call existentialism Marxism, or Marxist, but we're also ignoring important contributions to political thought made by 3 female thinkers. Thank you.